And just really quickly, if you went on to turn your cell phones off or put them on silent, just because the space carries really well. So you can just turn those on silent or vibrate. We really appreciate it. Just a little bit about the order of events. After Silas's presentation and talk, we'll open the floor up to questions for a Q&A with the audience for about 15 to 20 minutes. Silas will call on people directly, and then I'll have a microphone, and I'll bring the microphone to your area just so Silas and everyone in the audience can hear your question. And then following 20 minutes of Q&A, we'll have a book signing. So if you have a book to be signed, we're going to ask that you line up on the right aisle. And then if you're exiting or hanging around, just maybe exit out the middle aisle or the left aisle. We've had a couple questions about books for sale. We actually don't have any books for sale, but we have about 20 copies of Lark Ascending and Southernmost available. So if you would like to get a copy of that, just reach out to either Dr. Rachel Clark, who's right here, or Kendall Sewell, who's also in the front, if you'd like to get a copy of one of the books, and we'll see if we can get one. Before we bring Silas out, I just want to briefly thank a few people for making this event possible. First, I'd like to thank the Office of the President and the Administration for the Student Experience and Enhancement Fund, which has generously funded this talk. I'd also like to thank the Office of Academic Affairs, specifically Jenny Sheltman, for all of her help, as well as the Business Office. I'd also like to thank our school faculty, specifically the English and Gender Studies program, for all their support. And I'd also like to thank the theater program and Jeremy Cloyd for helping us when we had a change of venue, so thank you very much. And I was thinking about, before we bring Silas out, someone asked me recently, for our first large speaking event post-COVID, why we were bringing Silas House. It was a genuine question. They didn't mean it in any kind of nefarious way, but I had to think, I hadn't thought about why we had asked Silas House to be our first speaker in this post-COVID landscape. For us, it had just been a natural choice. We kind of did it thoughtlessly. And so the person who asked me this, it kind of made me think, why didn't we ask Silas House? And so I think, obviously, the first reason was because he's born in Kentucky, right? He writes at the South and all our complications and complexities in this really beautiful way. Obviously, he is a celebrated writer. He's won all sorts of awards. So obviously, that's a reason why. But I think when I reflect on it and the books that he's going to talk about today, I really feel like it taps into this communal experience we've all felt the last few years, particularly dealing with trauma and grief. And so I think on some level we connected with his work for those reasons as well. But without much ado, I'll bring Silas out now. So please join me in welcoming Professor Silas House.
Thank you all. Thank you for the kind welcome. I'm glad to be here today at Lindsey Wilson. I was here about, I don't know, 15 or 16 years ago, I think. So I'm glad to be back. I'm grateful to everyone that brought me here. Instead of reading to you from my work today, I thought it would be more interesting for all of you if I talked a little bit about how and why I wrote my last two novels. The process of making a novel is a mystifying thing to most people, especially the people who are doing it. And so it helps me to write a thought like this and to re-examine the way that I did that in a novel. So I'm going to talk to you about my last two books, Lark Ascending and Southernmost, mostly because many of the students have read those two books, and so it'll expand on the works for them, I hope. And if you haven't read those books, there are no spoilers, no big spoilers, so I'm conscious of that. I will talk to you for about 40 minutes, and then I'm going to turn it over to you, so I hope you'll have some questions and we can have a conversation. That's my favorite part of being on the road and visiting places is to talk to everybody. So Southernmost is set in two distinct places, rural Tennessee and Key West, Florida. I know rural Tennessee very well. I grew up about 30 miles from the Tennessee border, and I have had, and for many years I taught in Tennessee at Lincoln Memorial University, and I've worked on a law work in Nashville, and spent a lot of time there. I did not know as much about Key West, so I had to do research. So I learned the history of the island. I took a subscription to its newspaper. I lived there for as long as I could, about 3 months was all I could manage. But that's about the same amount of time that my characters lived there. Due to complicated reasons, my characters are living there in the summertime, and so I went there living in the summertime too. It's not when you really want to be in Key West, but it is a much less expensive time period. And while there, I didn't experience it like a tourist. I experienced it like someone who's living there, and that's really important. I took a ton of pictures. I attended the same church that my characters did. I studied its flora and fauna. I got to know what made it unique. I listened intently to its sounds. That's an iguana on your right. That jumped out of the tree right after that and about scared me to death. Now this is all kind of standard research, but I'm also talking here about keeping your eyes open while you're writing so that the world can feed the piece of writing that you're working on. On Del Hollow Lake, this is on the Kentucky-Tennessee border. It was a riverbank until it became Del Hollow Lake. And I just kept seeing this image and knowing that it was important to the book that I was working on. If you've read the novel, you'll know that a riverbank really doesn't show up until the very last scene of the book. But the idea of water informs that entire novel. And the book also started with this news item. An Amber Alert has been issued for 9-year-old Jessica Hooper. She was last seen with 30-year-old Liza Hooper on June 1st. The novelist's most important element is trouble and layers of trouble. And so when I read this little news item, I sort of came to some conclusions based on the last names and ages. That was probably a custodial kidnapping. That was a mother who had kidnapped her child. My mind went that she was probably doing it to protect the child and not for nefarious reasons. But then I started thinking about the different implications if a man had kidnapped his child, and how our mind sort of goes in different directions with that. We usually think it's probably a spiteful thing, or trying to gain power in the custody arrangement or something like that. And so just, those few seconds of thought about it made me think that there was some elements of some layers of trouble available there, especially if I changed the kidnapper to a man. So right around the time I had this idea for a novel about kidnapping, I went to Key West for the first time. I was there for the Key West Literary Seminar for 2 weeks in 2008. And as soon as I arrived in Key West, I knew that this was where my main character, Asher, would run off to when he kidnapped his 10-year-old son. And not just because I wanted an excuse to be in Key West. Mainly because Key West is the opposite of rural Tennessee, where Asher is from. It's the opposite in climate, in culture, the quality of light, and matters of acceptance, progressive thought, flora and fauna, music. It's a place of the ocean versus Asher's home is a place of the river. Just everything about it was so different that I had places in conflict. So I spent about 7 years writing the novel, and in that time I immersed myself in it any way that I could. One way I did this was by going through reading what other writers had written about it. The most famous writer associated with Key West is Ernest Hemingway, and the book that is most about Key West for men is to have Have Not. I read that. I read The Old Man and the Sea, which is also in that same area. I read a lot of Tennessee Williams, who lived in Key West, and poets like Wallace Stevens and Elizabeth Bishop. One of the first things I always do when I'm starting a novel is to surround myself with as much of the poetry, art, and music of the place as I can. And that helps to put me there. It educates me about the place. So every time I'd sit down to write, I would read a poem about Key West beforehand, and I would also be playing music that put me there. While writing the novel, I came upon this quote from the painter and poet William Blake, who first said, "For everything that lives is holy." Now this would be my main thesis for the novel, and I think we associate theses with like critical writing, but I always have a thesis in mind when I'm working on a novel. It's like, it's my opinion that I want to prove, and so I write the novel to prove that. So therefore it becomes my thesis. And once you start thinking this way, for everything that lives is holy, it changes the way you see everything. It changes the way you walk through the world. Nothing will heighten your senses more than walking through your day, thinking of everything you encounter as being holy. And it makes you observe in a much deeper way, because you're not only seeing it, you're also feeling it. You're studying it. And this is what writers must do. You can see how by now I'm firmly established the flow of my novel because I have my trouble, which we can also call plot. I have my emotion in the form of it being a novel about a parent and a child. I have my theme of empathy. And once you have those things, you have everything that you need for a novel to grow out of that properly. Some of you probably know about Thomas Merton. Merton was a French monk who lived most of his life in rural Kentucky, near Bardstown, Abbey, Tennessee. And in the 1960s, he became one of the most famous people in the world. He wrote a lot about religion in an ecumenical way, and is perhaps best known for joining elements of Catholicism and Buddhism. He was a student of Blake, who I referenced, and he changed Blake's saying to be a little more accessible. He wrote about it this way: everything that is holy. Merton was also a monk who had famously written about an epiphany he had in downtown Louisville. To my knowledge, it's the only historical marker in the United States that's about an epiphany, about a religious epiphany. You can find it down there. It's at the corner of what is now 4th and Muhammad Ali. But he wrote about it this way: in Louisville, at the corner of 4th and Walnut, in the center of the shopping district, I was suddenly overwhelmed with the realization that I loved all those people, that they were mine and I theirs, that we could not be alien to one another even though we were total strangers. There is no way of telling people that they are walking around shining like the sun. When I read that, I knew that I was getting closer to the theme of my novel, empathy, because the world was feeding me this stuff, and it was really that my antennae were up for this stuff. Southernmost, more than anything, is an examination of the way everyone living in the world is holy. And if you're writing about empathy, this is something you have to believe. In Southernmost, I was trying to look at people of faith in relationship to LGBTQ issues, and to put every reaction they might have on the page. I wanted to explore the entire spectrum of Christianity without making any of my characters into caricatures. And honestly, usually in literature, people of faith are caricatures. They're usually there to be made fun of. They're usually there for comedic effect, or as the villains. And I didn't want to do that. I wanted it to be complicated. So in the book, that spectrum includes people who are fanatical bigots. It also includes people of faith who are completely open-minded. Some of them don't believe in a traditional God, but some sort of creator. I wanted to explore the wide spectrum of belief without belittling any of the people I was portraying, even the ones I disagreed with. This is the kind of grand thing a novel must tackle. So in my novel, my main character has an epiphany where he realizes the same thing. When I'm working on a novel, I don't like to read other novels that are similar in theme, that are revolving around the same thing. But I do seek out books that are touching on that, or sort of on the peripheral. Since this book was so much about theology and about a person who's going through a conversion, I looked for other art about that. And so these are some of the books that I was reading at the time. Usually when we hear someone going through a religious conversion, they're becoming more religious. But in the case of my lead character, he's becoming less religious and more spiritual. So I looked for art. I looked for that in art, and I looked for that in novels and films. And this included some of the ones you see behind me. The film being Ingmar Bergman's Winter Light, if any of you are Bergman fans. And especially music, which is such a huge part of my whole process. Anytime I write a novel, I create a soundtrack for the novel. And each character has their own songs, but then the book itself has its major themes, major songs. In this book, the main character, Asher, is obsessed with Patty Griffin, a singer that I love. There's a little boy who's 10 years old who's obsessed with My Morning Jacket, which is a great Kentucky band. Joni Mitchell is one of the characters loves Joni Mitchell. So by knowing who their favorite artists are, I know more about them, and you as the reader know about them more too. And what I really love is it makes it interactive, because you can go listen to all this music. So anytime a novel of mine is published, I always I make a Spotify playlist, but my students have taught me that it is more egalitarian to also make a YouTube playlist, because then you don't have to have a subscription, anybody can listen to it. So there's always a YouTube and a Spotify. So now, I'm 2 years into the novel, and I'm still mostly just creating my character. I really need an impetus for the action, and then in May of 2010, that came about from Mother Nature. That May, there occurred the biggest flood in more than 80 years in Tennessee and Kentucky. More than 40 people died, thousands of homes were destroyed, and this provided another layer of trouble. I also had personal experience. My family survived a childhood flood, a flash flood. My mother and I barely escaped it. She had to carry me out with the water rising from her ankles to her neck. And then at the time of the 2010 flood, I was staying in Nashville at the time, and I was working in the country music industry doing a lot of anonymous writing. And one of my best friends there lost her home in the flood. So the two most important elements in a piece of fiction are emotion and suspense. Using the flood as the opening action piece of my novel allowed me to really embody it with deep emotion. And every novel needs a great action piece to kick it off, both literally and metaphorically. So now I had a natural disaster that could put all the high emotions of the characters into overdrive. And so the opening paragraph of the book became this. The rain had been falling with a pounding meanness without ceasing for 2 days, and then the water rose all at once in the middle of the night. A brutal rush so fast, Asher thought at first a dam might have broken somewhere upstream. The ground had simply become so saturated it could not hold any more water. All the creeks were conspiring down the ridges until they washed out into the Congo. There was no use in anyone going to bed because they all knew what was going to happen. They only had to wait. So as soon as I wrote that, I knew I had the opening that I needed. I had this action sequence that was giving me the emotion, the mystery, and all that. So we're moving through time, and I'm writing, sustaining myself with what's going on in the world, in music, in poetry, films, and just daily discoveries that kept me writing. I had known all this time that the kidnapping was going to, in some way, be related to faith. But for the first time, I realized that my lead character was a pastor who was going to have to stand up for what he believed in. But all signs pointed to things were progressing on this issue, I had no idea that eventually the novel would be more relevant than I could imagine. In 2013, something happened that completely transformed the novel. That year, the Reverend Frank Schaefer, a Methodist pastor in rural Pennsylvania, was asked by his gay son if he would perform his wedding ceremony. Reverend Schaefer knew that this went in direct opposition to the doctrines of the Methodist Church, but he chose his son over the church. And since then, many of you know that this is an issue that has split the Methodist Church. As soon as it was revealed, he was defrocked and told that he would only be reinstated if he publicly apologized. He refused to do so, taking a principled stand for his son and for all people who just wanted to be treated equal. He became a folk hero to lots of people, especially rural LGBTQ folks, people of faith in particular. So he was the perfect inspiration for the preacher I had been writing about for so long, and suddenly I knew what my character had to do. He had to stand up against his church and his whole community to make a principled stand for equality. This was the perfect moment for a novel that I had always wanted to center on empathy. So you can see here that even the real events of the world are shaping the flow of my creative process. And again, it's all about being open to everything as an artist to help feed your art. Around this time, my children were in high school, and I became far more conscious of bullying against LGBTQ people. And it was becoming a bigger part of the news as well. So this is very much in my mind as I was writing the novel, and I was seeing it more and more as a call for empathy. And the child in the book becomes more important as well. And so the issues of bullying become larger in the news, especially bullying of LGBTQ children. It's taking up more space. The whole time I was gathering all the information I could, all the trouble that I could, conflict, crisis, complications, those are the things of novels. Then, in June 2015, everything changed when the Supreme Court decided on marriage equality, which made many LGBTQ people feel like full citizens for the first time, but it also ignited a firestorm, especially from evangelical corners like the one that I was raised from. So suddenly my novel was more relevant than it had been before. And I knew I had something really worthwhile to share with the world. While many people saw marriage equality as Indian discrimination and homophobia, gay people saw it as only the beginning and the bigotry that produced fruit that. Although county court clerks all over the nation were doing the same thing, this woman became the face of discrimination all over the world. Kim Davis, y'all probably remember her. She was sanctimonious and brazen in her defiance. And once again, Kentuckians were being held up as symbols of bigotry and backwardness and discrimination. So it gave me an even bigger desire to write a novel that complexified rural people on the issue and showed that not everyone is like Kim Davis in Kentucky. She does show up briefly in the novel, she's mentioned. But as adamantly opposed as I was and I am to what Kim Davis stood for, I wanted to write a novel in which nobody is a caricature, in which everybody's a human being. And the way the world loved to make fun of the way Kim Davis looked and the way she dressed made me more aware of that. It became almost like people weren't making fun of her as much about her stance on this issue as they were that she was from Kentucky and she was from a little small town and she was rural and she wore a big long denim skirt and she was apostolic, and it was almost that her actions, her refusal to do her job, sort of took a background to the stereotypes that it was perpetuating. And so, like I said, I wanted to show belief all across the spectrum, from someone that I consider to be bigoted like Kim Davis to a totally accepting character, but I wanted them all to possess complexity. she helped me do that because she helped me to think about that and to put myself in her shoes, even though I disagree with everything that she's about. So all of this is just fueling what I want to do in the book, making it better, making it stronger. I'm watching all of it closely, and most of all, I'm seeing it through the eyes of my characters, not just me. Throughout the entire 7 or 8 years of working on this novel, I had these writing assistants, and it makes sense that dogs show up throughout the book. Once I got into revising the book, I began to see that throughout the novel, dogs represent the presence of the divine. Sometimes dogs are missing, as is faith for some characters. Sometimes dogs are found, as is belief again for one of the characters. I don't consciously plant symbolism. For it to work, it has to happen organically. Once I'm in revision, I might see it's there, and I turn the knob up a little bit. I turn the volume up. But it must show up on its own. Dogs as representatives of the divine makes perfect sense to me because I never feel more in the presence of goodness than when I'm with an animal. And for some people, it's horse or cat or dog. For me, it's always been a dog. So this book is very much informed of them. By the way, when I'm doing a national book tour, people have a much different response to when I talk about dogs because all they focus on is the way I say dog. And then in the signing line, everybody wants me to repeat it. When you say dog, I don't expect to get that as much here. And by the way, I've lost all 3 of these dogs, so I'm so glad they're a part of this novel. And I just thought I'd tell you as a brief aside, because I get asked a lot about this. There is a film being made of Southernmost right now. It's a really beautiful script, and I didn't write the script, but I'm very happy with it. And it's been mostly cast. The 3 leads have been cast. The main character, Asher, is being played by Jefferson White. If you watch Yellowstone, he's one of the more popular actors on Yellowstone, and they sort of think this is his big breakout cinematic role. And they're hoping to film some of the movie here in Kentucky. These 3 roles have not been cast yet, but these are actors I'd like to see cast in the roles. The boy I want to play Justin lives in Louisville and has been in several films. Having said that, I have no power in any of that. And having said that, my books have been optioned for film before and they didn't get made. So I don't plan on anything. I won't believe it until I walk into a movie theater and see it. But I'm telling you all, so you can send all of your good vibes to Hollywood to help us get this made. So hopefully I've given you some perspective on how a writer goes about building a novel like Southernmost. It's all about finding the theme, finding the emotion, and inserting as much trouble and suspense as you can to keep the reader invested. I wanted this book to be a literary thriller. I wanted it to be language driven, but I wanted it to be really propulsive. It's difficult and frustrating, and sometimes a writer feels like the novel is going to kill them. But when it all comes together, there's nothing more satisfying. What sustains me more than anything is being an observer and using everything I can find to build that world and my characters. So since we have time, I'll also talk about the art in its many forms that influenced Marcus Cindy, which came out the year before last. Especially the way art buoyed me in trying times. I've always been a writer who's been fed by all forms of art, and the ones that have been most important to me have been music, film, photography, paintings, and of course other creative writing, such as I've already talked about poetry, fiction, nonfiction. I'll read some short excerpts from this one. But first I want to tell you about the seeds for this novel and the way I built the novel. This is a book born of deep grief. In the winter of 2015, I lost my aunt, Sis, who had been a second mother to me. She was a third parent. Sis was foundational in every way for me. She fostered my love for cinema. She bought me my first typewriter, my first guitar, most of my first books. And when she died, I was absolutely shattered. This is my favorite picture of us. Even though you can't see her very well, you can see the way that she's holding me and guiding me and teaching me. She adored me and I adored her. We had a special connection, and in many ways she was the parent that I needed. The parent that my mother and father sometimes could not be due to their strict fundamentalist beliefs at the time. This is her the summer before we lost her. I had never lost anyone close to me, and I was shocked the night she died to find myself in the floor, howling with pain. This was a profound mourning that I didn't know existed. It was complex, physical, overwhelming. It was riddled with regret, anger, and most of all, deep sorrow. But life would not allow me to remain in the floor for too long. Months before, I had signed a contract that committed me to a job at the National University of Ireland at Galway as a visiting writer. The day after the funeral, I had to board a plane and leave my family and everything that I knew and go overseas. And I sort of remember floating through the airport like a ghost. I can barely remember delivering the lectures I'd been hired to do, the dinners with faculty and students. Each day involved the process of waking up and realizing over and over that Sis was gone, that although she had visited me in dreams, she had irreversibly died. Nothing changes us more than grief. If you have experienced profound grief, you know that it's a paradigm shift. There's a before and an after. Nothing is ever the same again. I do remember moments of great beauty and wonder during my time in Ireland. The kindness of the people, the melancholy gray of the skies over Galway Bay, the incredible cleanness of the air as I rode a bicycle on Inishmore. I remember most of all this little dog who followed me on a grassy trail where I was walking and grieving. He followed me for about 2 miles or so. And at a certain point, I squatted down, to try to pet him, and he finally came to me, and we sort of had an eye-to-eye conversation for a few minutes as I rested. And he looked me right in the eyes as if to say, I've known loss too. I know how you feel. And he visited me on the path just when I needed him. And in that moment, he seemed like a beacon of hope for me, a creature that was encouraging me to keep going, to stay the course, to focus on what I had instead of what I had lost. So after a time, he turned and walked away as if to say, my work here is done. And I often use my camera as a way to document and take notes. And so as he was leaving, I thought I should take a picture of him in case I needed to describe him later. At the time, I thought about writing about him in an essay. And just as I brought my phone up to take his picture, he turned around and posed like this. And I took the picture and he scampered away. So more on him in a bit. I have survived every trouble in my life by turning to the natural world, to dogs, to books, and music, to art. Art has carried me throughout my life. My consumption of art and my creation of art. So I began to write a novel about a young man who is going through the worst grief imaginable. He has not only lost everyone he's ever known and loved, but also he's lost his country. He is utterly alone, and he's undone in sorrow. My goal was to write a book where the main character has lost everything. The love of his life, his entire family, his country, but he holds on to hope. Holds on to his humanity. And so that book became Lark Ascended. The book is set 20 years in the future, but to me it is not a dystopian, futuristic, or science fiction book. It's about what is already in motion for us as a people living under the looming shadow of climate change and the rising vitriol that continues to divide us so deeply as a country. In my book, things get so bad that there are very few Americans left, and they end up being refugees on a boat trying to get into Ireland, the last country offering sanctuary. It centers around one family, but the main character, Lark, is the only one who makes it to Ireland. So it is a book about catastrophe, but more than that, it's about hope, the will to survive, and the way that realizing the beauty and the holiness of the world can carry us through. It's still puzzling to me that I wrote a book that's set in the future, but as I said, it's really about right now, and I set it a couple decades forward to accentuate some of the more troubling aspects of the current climate. But my vision of the future is not one of robots and flying cars. It's one that's much more like the past. People are living in small groups, trying to survive by hunting, fishing, foraging. There's no digital technology. It's a world without cell phones, the internet, or electricity. I wanted the novel to feel like an old school adventure novel. So I turned to great adventure stories. Kidnapped by Robert Louis Stevenson, The Call of the Wild by Jack London. I think if you've read those books, you'll instantly recognize the influence in them. By extension, I always also looked at their companion books, Treasure Island and White Fang. Now, these books are sometimes thought of as children's literature, but I would not call them that. The vocabulary is sophisticated, and so are the themes. While Treasure Island might be more of a children's story, Kidnapped is going deep into Scottish politics at the time, as a staunch anti-England slant. These books in particular helped me to capture the language I wanted to capture. I was aiming for a more timeless narration. I was thinking of a world 20 years without TV, recorded music, the internet, and how that might change the way we speak. So my narrator has a much more elegant way of speaking than we do today, to the point of perhaps being even kind of old-fashioned. The beginning of the book is a direct homage to Robert Louis Stevenson, since his book Treasure Island begins this way. These gentlemen haven't asked me to write down the whole particulars about Treasure Island from the beginning to the end, keeping nothing back. I take up my pen and go back to the time when the old seaman first took up his lodging under our roof. Compare that to the beginning of Laureate Ascended. They have all asked me to write down the whole particulars about how I came to be here from the beginning to the end, keeping nothing back. And so I take pen in hand in my old age to go back when my parents and I crossed the Atlantic Ocean in the hopes of sanctuary on the green island of Ireland. Also, there's a boat sinking in Laureate Ascended. The boat is named the Covenant, just as the shipwrecked boat in Kidnapped is. And so these little homages are done in the hopes of someone noticing, but if they don't, that's okay too. It doesn't take anything away if you don't think about Treasure Island. And of course, the Jack London books taught me a lot about how to portray a dog accurately in the book, which is one of the biggest challenges, since one of the main characters is a dog, and is in fact a dog who has his own passages in the book, in which we're seeing the world from his point of view. This is my beagle, Ari. He's 5 years old. And I must pause here to tell you that the dog is not killed in the book. Sometimes people won't read it because they know it involves the dog, and they're too afraid, that it'd be traumatizing. I asked them to put a disclaimer on the outside of the book, but they wouldn't. I don't know why. With that said, the book takes place over a course of about 90 years, and we all know that unfortunately dogs don't live that long. But the dog is not killed or hurt in a dramatic way. It's a very tender moment towards the end of the book. On one hand, I wanted the dog to be relatable to the readers who are going to be human, but I also wanted him to be an animal. I didn't want to project too many human traits on him. And that was probably the hardest thing to do, was to find just right that balance. But it made for a much richer writing experience for me because I'm thinking so much about it. Anytime you have a challenge like that, it makes the writing better. When I started working on the book, I used what I knew best, grief and walking, which I did a lot of to help process that grief and put me in touch with the natural world, and dogs, which have always been a manifestation of the divine for me ever since I was a little boy. I kept thinking about that little dog I had met in Ireland. But when I began to write about him, I was trying to write about a dog, a breed of dog that I don't know. And so a friend of mine had a little border collie, which is what that dog in Ireland was like. And so I was calling her all the time, like asking for every minute detail of her border collie's life. You know, how does he do this and this? And finally, she very diplomatically but firmly said, you know, you have a perfectly good beagle that you could be right about. And so I thought, well, I don't associate beagles with Ireland. And so one of my best friends lived in Ireland 30 years. She's from Ireland originally. And so I called her and I said, you know, growing up in Ireland, living in Ireland, did you ever see beagles? And she said, oh, we had loads of beagles. And so that gave me the permission I needed to use my beagle. And so he's very much an inspiration. My dog, that is my dog on the cover of the book, but they sort of roughed him up a little because, you know, this is a dog in a catastrophe, so he has to look a little dusty and skinny. He's very proud of the fact that he's on the cover of the book. So I thought I'd read you a really brief scene where Laura meets the dog for the first time. And the dog has a very Irish name, it's Silas. I waited. I was so tired I could barely move, but somehow I thought if the dog might come near and put his wet nose into the palm of my hand, I would be re-energized. This one act would be enough to get me through. And so this was the first time he saved me. The dog came forward, but now he hesitated, took one step back, his brown eyes locked onto my face. It's okay, buddy, I said. I realized that even my lips were tired. I felt slack-jawed. The rain was falling quiet and soft like small feet stamping the leaves, but I knew that any minute the sky would open up. The sound of thunder was shifting closer and louder. Please, I said to the dog. I did not want to be alone. He ventured close enough for me to pet him. There were small twigs and cockleburrs caught in his fur, but his coat was somehow clean and smooth, as if he had been careful to bathe and groom himself on his journey. I leaned down and he startled me with a lick to the nose. He was wearing a red collar, bright against his black and white coat. I took hold of it and there was a small round silver medallion hanging from it that read, Silas. I took the dog's ears in each hand and felt them in my palms, smoothed down his neck and along his back. He was looking at me as if he had been craving such a massage. Silas's eyes had sorrow in them. This old boy knew what deep loss was, just as I did. Two creatures can always tell that about one another. So when I wrote that scene, I realized that the dog in the book would be a symbol of hope throughout the book, for everybody in the book. I don't want to give too much away, but I will tell you that this dog Lark encounters may or may not be the last dog left in all of Ireland. So his existence gives the humans in the story a lot of hope that things can go forward, that life will go on. So this novel does begin in Appalachia about 20 years from now. A climate catastrophe has led to devastating forest fires that have led to widespread famine, an insurrection in which a fundamentalist group takes over the government, and a push northeast by the few people who have been killed in the war or hunger. This family walks from their home on the West Virginia-Maryland border all the way to Maine, where a wildlife refuge offers them a temporary respite before the fires creep closer. Here they're happy, fending for themselves on the mountain for a couple of years. One of the things that keeps them going are the many waterfalls and creeks and rivers that flow there, offering them fresh water and recreation. And the waterfall is so important in the book that it appears on the cover of the hardback. But unfortunately, their halcyon days are interrupted when the forest fires reach them, and they have to keep walking to Nova Scotia, where they've heard there are refugee boats waiting to take them to the last country accepting American refugees, Ireland. So they crowd on to one of these overstuffed boats, and they languish in misery for 3 weeks during the transatlantic crossing. So of course I had to do a tremendous amount of research, from reading about the history of refugee crises to actually doing the math to figure out the size of the boat they'd need. if it was realistic for such a boat to make the crossing, how many people would make it incredibly crowded, etc. And I looked to film a lot to understand more about refugee crises and people on the run from regimes, such as the ones pictured here, the white ribbon in particular, which is about the way an entire generation can accept atrocity. So I know Appalachia and Ireland very well, the two main settings of the book, but I have not made a transatlantic journey. Luckily, my editor is a sailor, so she helped me to learn all about sailing and the complications of that. But I really had to immerse myself in what it would be like to be in the middle of the ocean. And I read accounts by refugees who had survived really rough crossings. I listened to recordings. I watched videos of the ocean in the North Atlantic during times of calm and times of storm. I studied photographs like this one. But strangely enough, paintings really helped me to capture the beauty and balance the ocean in ways that not even video was able to. So I looked at a lot of paintings, and these were three of the ones that were helpful to me. Again, you can see how I'm turning to every medium I can. I'm looking at shipwrecks and painting, and trying to capture that on the page. And that brings us to Ireland. This photo is of Sherkin Island, which is in the southern part of West Cork. If you know your Irish geography, it's about 2 hours straight south of Cork City. And this is where the dog is from. We have scenes there with the dog. And in my main character, my main character, Laureate, is on an odyssey, aiming for a particular safe haven in Ireland. And for most of the novel, he's walking. I walked the entire route that Laureate does in the book. So everything he encounters along the way, I encountered on my walks. If you ever get to go to Ireland, do it. And I can tell you how to do these walks if you want to. Also, I was reading poetry, of course, because that's what I always do. The Irish greats like Yeats, Seamus Heaney, who the dog is named for, and even Bowland, my three favorite Irish poets. But nothing helps me more than the musical landscape. By the time I finished the novel, I had a core group of about 60 songs I listened to continuously while working on the novel. But this playlist reflects the most important ones. There are 24 of them that I've shared with the public. I thought a lot about if we didn't have recorded music or electricity for 20 years, what would people still be sitting around campfires singing at night or as they walked or whatever? I knew that people would still be singing John Prine songs, because anytime I'm in a gathering and there's a guitar, somebody knows a John Prine song. So he shows up throughout the book. My favorite John Prine song is You Got Go. If you don't know, look it up. It has a walking tempo. I knew that I would still know Brandy Carlisle songs in 20 years because I know all of her songs because I'm obsessed with her. Tom Petty, because he's my favorite singer, and I can sing any of his songs by heart. And I think a lot of people can. And the title of the novel comes from my favorite piece of classical music. And if you will do one thing for me when you leave here. Go to YouTube and look up The Lark Ascending. It's 14 minutes long, but listen to it really loud with no distractions. It's a transcendent piece of music. And it's a journey. The song is a journey, just like the novel is. But nothing inspired me as much as Ireland itself. That's me in Ireland on this trip, trying to enjoy as much of the natural world as I could. And the book ends in a monastic settlement that I will tell you more about if I have more time. It's called Glendalough, and I want you to know that because it's Irish. It's an Irish word, so it's not always phonetic for us to read. It looks like it would be Glenda Lowe. It's Glenda Locke. And so at Glenda Locke is a powerful place in Ireland. It's known for being a thin place, and a thin place is where the veil is thinner between the natural world and the supernatural world. So it's a power place. There are all kinds of thin places in the United States, but the most famous one is Sedona. That's known as a place. People don't really know why a place is a thin place. It might be because of certain minerals that are there. It might be more supernatural than that. At Glenda Locke, people have been praying for the past 7 centuries, pretty much without ceasing. So the question is it a holy place because people have been praying there for centuries? Or were the people drawn to pray there because it was already a holy place? And so it's a safe place in the book. So I'm going to close by just reading you my favorite passage in the book. And then I hope you all have some questions for me. Some more pictures of love. There were days of hunger and misery. There were days of starting all over. We did not give up. We lived. Days of celebration and mourning. Times of quiet and fire, of low storm clouds and skies so blue they stirred up that ache of melancholy that comes with witnessing beauty. Days of simply surviving. But always there were days of wonder. I've been through many hardships, just like all of us. But most days, the grief is balanced out by the pleasures. A delicious meal, the smell of cedar on my hands, the sound of rushing water, good friends, joy and sorrow are the things in life. The two always tangled together. Anybody who's ever lost anyone knows that. I've burned, and that's what I wish for all of you, to burn with anger, desire, joy, sorrow, all of it. And so I think that when I wrote that passage, I knew that I had accomplished what I wanted to for the book. And when you're mired in grief, it doesn't matter what people say to you, no matter how good their advice is. You have to come to it on your own terms. And for me, writing the book allowed me to come to the point where I started to focus more on what I had and less on what I had lost. And realizing that the grief is so large because the love is so large. And so, the spin just becomes more positive on it. And that makes it survivable in a different way. The grief never leaves you, but it changes and it becomes more manageable, I guess. And so every book that I write, I always think is a selfish act because the writing of it helps me to survive something or it answers a question for me. And so these 2 books really did that for me. So thank you all for listening. We have time for questions, right?
Yes, we do. So we have about 15 to 20 minutes for questions. So we'll end the mic off. If you have a question, just raise your hand.
Process for whenever you choose themes, you seem to choose themes around things that concern you about the modern day. Do you have a process for that? Because you did have like the thoughts that you had about Southernmost. You had it before it became a huge issue. It was always a huge issue, but more of a front issue in the news. Do you have a process for that, or is it just kind of whatever's bothering you or prominent in your life at that point?
It's more just what's on my mind, what I want to challenge myself by writing about. Both of those books the themes are so, it's really hard to write books that have social issues as their central core, because you don't want to preach. You don't want to write a polemic. You don't want to beat people over the head with it. So in both those cases, what I worked really hard on was creating characters that you would feel attached to or frustrated with or whatever. and issues are going on in the background, you know. So right now, I'm writing a novel that I want to write. There is no great Appalachian love story, so I'm trying to write that. And that's a challenge. It's a real challenge to write a big sweeping romance, you know, because it's very easy to be sappy, and it's really hard to write, you know, about relationships in that way. So it's a lot about pining and desire, people who can't have each other, longing and stuff like that. So it's not so much social issues, it's more of a big, broad romance, you know, that I'm trying to write. I don't know if I'll be able to do it or not, but I'm trying to.
Other questions? At lunch, we talked a little bit about like mountaintop mining and stuff. And since Lark Ascending is focused on wildfires rather than like mountaintop mining or water pollution, I was curious about if there was like a particular moment when you knew that Lark Ascending had to be a climate change focused novel for you, or if it was just like accumulation of everything that you've seen living in Appalachia and in other areas in the States.
I think it was mostly because I was, you know, in such deep grief about my aunt, and not too long after that, Australia burned. And they've estimated that 1 billion animals died in those fires. And I don't know, I had never never identified my thoughts about climate change and things like that as grief until then. It just really troubled me when that fire happened. And so it made me start thinking how, even if we're not thinking too much about it, there's something in us that recognizes, I think not everybody, but most of us realize that weather is becoming more extreme, and you know that it's going to affect the poorest people and things like that. So I think there's a grief involved in that. For me, there's also a grief in climate change denial that's really frustrating as well. And so I was just sort of using my personal grief, but also thinking about collective grief. I also think a lot of us have grieved over, I think a lot of us grieve over the way we're so divided as a nation politically. I know that's caused me a lot of heartache. You know, people that I love so deeply who have supported things that I find, you know, unconscionable. And it's really difficult to love somebody from afar, or to love somebody you don't respect, you know? And so I think I have a lot of grief around that. So I was thinking about those three kinds of griefs.
Do you have a message as a writer, of like, or as a person that 50 years from now, you want people to be like, oh, when I think of Silas House, this is what I think of. Like, do you have a kind of a core message that you're trying to spread or live out, as a writer, as a person?
That's a hard question. I mean, I think that in every one of my books, the natural world is a huge part of it. I always want people to think more about nature. And I don't want them to think about it in a precious way. You know, I just want them to think about it, period. And I think also that I always wrote about the complications of family, and I always wrote about two very different kinds of family. In some ways, they're very different. I wrote about blood, kin, and creative family. And I think for a whole lot of us, creative family is very important to us, especially if we feel abandoned by blood families at times, you know. Sometimes the people who love us the most do the most damage to us, you know, and so you have to create a family for yourself in some ways. But for me, I mean, I could never, blood family and creative family are both very important to me, and I always want to write about that. And I mean, really that's the most universal theme possible, because everybody can relate to family in some way, you know. And I would like for people to think that, you know, most of the empathy is a theme that runs through all of my work. I never want to simplify anybody in my work. Thank you. I had some really great questions earlier from students too.
Okay, I'm gonna throw back. My favorite line you've ever written is, "Whole scenes of your life can slip away forever if you don't put them down on ink." I'm not a writer, but I'm a therapist, and I'm curious as to how you take scenes from your life and create healthy boundaries between yourself and your characters as you're navigating these real life issues that are happening around us.
I think throughout all of my work, there are little snapshots of my real life that I'm preserving. That if you're reading the book, it's just a little scene to you, but for me, it's remembering like that. I think that's from Parchment Leaves. It's for me not good. Okay, I wrote them a long time ago, but in A Parchment Leaves, my second novel, there's a scene where a little girl is running out into this field of wildflowers, and sort of the wildflowers swallow her up. And that was, something that's like a pivotal memory for me of my little girl when she first started to be able to walk. She ran into this field of wildflower. So I'm always preserving stuff like that in the book. But I think the larger issue, especially if you as a therapist, is writing things down can help so much, Even if you're going to burn it later or tear it up or whatever, but to get it out of you. And I think that's a lesson I learned as a child. There weren't a whole lot of boys who wanted to be writers growing up. And so at first I got really bullied for it, people make fun of me a lot. And so I would just write whatever I wanted to about in my notebook, I couldn't necessarily fight them back all the time. But being a little boy in Eastern Kentucky growing up, I did have to fight a lot, but I fought back mostly in my notebook. And so I think that taught me a lesson about the power of the written word. And since it's been published, every other year I teach in a children's prison down near Bowling Green. And the children I teach they're all under 16, and they've all killed somebody. And so I'm teaching them how to channel their anger into writing and things like that. It's one of the best opportunities I've been given as a writer to do that. So yeah, I think writing is a big part of any therapy.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. It's been truly wonderful. My question for you is about the Tyler Childers video, In Your Love. That video, I know for people in my life that I care a lot about, was showing love of a story that's not told in Kentucky. And so I know it was very meaningful, for example, to this person I was talking about. So I was just curious if you would just kind of elaborate on your connection to that.
Well, the main thing is we made that video because there are a whole lot of people who've never seen themselves in a country music video. And so we wanted them to see themselves. It's the first gay love story in a country music video. And we wanted to tell, just a story that spanned years, has a lot of layers in 4 minutes. So we were doing a lot. And I was just so happy with the way, I thought everybody who worked on it just did their best jobs. Everybody that worked on it knew they were doing something important. Something that was making country music history. It's already in the Country Music Hall of Fame now, And so, I don't know, that makes you want to give your all to it. So we were basically up for 3 whole days working on that video. And then we got a Grammy nomination for it and 2 CMT nominations, even though CMT hasn't played the video. So that's interesting. We lost the Grammy to the Beatles. So I don't know why the Beatles needed another Grammy. They weren't even there to accept it. But thank you for asking. I was proud to be part of that. And Tyler Childers is somebody who really takes risks, not to get attention, but because he cares about people and wants them to be seen and know that he sees them.
We can take one more question.
Hi, In one of my classes, we read Jane Eyre, and we talked about how her name was like really significant. Like during that style, a lot of novels were only listed their first name, and how like her last name was significant to like the meaning of the overall story. How in your novels, like, did you choose your characters' names, or like were they based off people you knew, or did they have like a specific meaning you had in mind?
I love that question. Well, one thing is I'm usually writing about rural people, and there's so many stereotypical names for rural characters. So one of my main rules is that I have to make sure that people are actually named that. You know, that it doesn't sound like just something that you'd expect from the region. In my first novel, a lot of the character names are people I actually knew. Even the real poetic ones, like one of my characters is named Dreamer, and people love that name and ask me about it all the time, but I went to high school with a girl named Dreamer, you know? And so, the names always have to really mean something. They have to work on at least 3 layers. I have to give you 3 reasons I gave you those names, or I don't name them now. So like Eli the Goat, for instance. Throughout the book, you know, he's portrayed, he's very ill, and he's sort of weak and afraid, and it takes a lot for him to stand up for what he believes in, and things like that. And so it was important for me to have a real little name, like Eli, you know. But it's also a really strong name once it's spoken aloud and claimed, you know. So I mean, I think that deeply about every name. Asher and Southernmost, I mean, that's just it has so many religious connotations, but it's not like a name that is so biblical that your first thought goes to it being an overly religious name. You know, just things like that. That's one of my favorite parts, is getting to name the characters and get really think through that, but it can also be really difficult. And sometimes I'll have a placeholder name until I get the right name, the character never really comes to life. But yeah, I think most of the time, every character name it's very purposeful. I never pluck them out of the air. Even my secondary characters, I think a lot about their names. For me, a lot of it's how it looks on the page as well. Is that it?
Yeah, so.
Thank y'all so much.
Yes, let's give them a round of applause. So we'll go ahead and start the book signing. Rachel and Kendall are going to get us set up for that. You're welcome to hang out if you'd like, but if you're going to get a book signed, just if you don't mind, line up on the right side, if that's all right, and then just exit either through the middle or out the stores here. So thank you all.